Good afternoon. Welcome to Teaching Artists Tuesdays 3. My name is Lenora Helm-Hammonds, and I am director of the North Carolina Central University Teaching Artist Certificate Program. And we are here in collaboration with the North Carolina Arts Council to bring you a continuation of our webinar series, Teaching Artists Tuesdays. We're really excited about today, and we have a wonderful panel set up for you. We hope that you will enjoy the conversation today about grant making in the arts. I am going to just tell you a little bit about the overview. Developing your grant toolkit, tips and resources for successful arts grant making. The webinar is going to aim to break down the grants process and provide insights and helpful tips of what makes for a compelling grant application and a successful grant application. You're going to learn from grant administrators, grant panelists, and leading artists of how to ensure your work and passion is truly represented on the page when you submit your grant application. So I'm going to introduce you to my co-moderator from North Carolina Arts Council. It's Kathleen Collier from the Arts and Education. She's the Arts and Education Director at North Carolina Arts Council and the Accessibility Coordinator. And I am going to hand it over to you, Kathleen.
Great, thank you, Lenora, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I have the pleasure of introducing our guest panelists. I'll go ahead and jump right in. I do want to say throughout today's webinar, feel free to type any questions into the Q&A or chat box. We're happy to address those. Really, our goal today is just to kind of demystify the grants process and answer any questions you may have. So feel free, I hope we can continue this conversation. Feel free to reach out to me or Lenora or any of our guest panelists as well after today's event. We're always happy to answer any questions. So we are waiting for one more guest panelist. I heard they ran into a bit of traffic, so hopefully Saba will be joining us a little bit later. She's a visual artist based in Durham and has experience both applying for grants as well as serving as a panelist here at the North Carolina Arts Council. So she may be joining us a little bit later. But right now, I'm excited to go ahead and introduce Rhonda and Holly. So here, I'm going to read y'all's bios very briefly, and then we'll jump right into the discussion questions. Rhonda Bellamy is president and CEO of the Arts Council of Wilmington and New Hanover County, an agency she helped establish in 2012. Its predecessor, the Arts Council of the Lower Cape Fear, closed its doors in 2002. She is also chair-elect of Arts North Carolina. Prior to full-time work in the arts, Rhonda was an award-winning news director, anchor, talk show host with 22 years in radio, television, and print in the Wilmington market. Currently, she is host and executive producer of Around Town with Rhonda Bellamy on WHQR Public Media. Thank you, Rhonda, for joining us today. And Holly Garriot is the executive director of Emerge Gallery and Art Center, home of the Pitt County Arts Council. Holly founded Emerge Gallery in Greenville, North Carolina in 2000. In 2009, Emerge became the designated partner to the North Carolina Arts Council at the local arts agency, where Pitt County had no arts council for nearly 2 decades prior to that. For over 20 years, Holly has helped build the arts community in Pitt County and has assisted with the revitalization of the Uptown Greenville district. Holly has dedicated her career to making the arts accessible for the entire community and enhancing the quality of life for the Pitt County and Eastern North Carolina community. She has overseen nearly 100 public art projects and received many grants throughout the years, including the National Endowment for the Arts, Our Town grant, and most recently, $250,000 to subgrant to Pitt County arts organizations through the American Rescue Plan. So thank you so much for joining us, Holly.
I'm happy to be here.
All right, well, we'll jump right on in. So our first question for panelists is getting started. Why are the grant guidelines just as important as the actual application? And are there any other resources or information an artist should check out before starting their actual application?
I'll defer to you, Holly.
Yeah, I think, you always want to start with the guidelines. Number one, to make sure that you're eligible for that specific grant. Sometimes grants are only available for a geographic area. Sometimes, when we hear grant and we are an artist or an individual, a lot of grants are only for organizations or nonprofit organizations. So to make sure that it is specific, if you're applying as an individual, that you are eligible, whether your art form is eligible. So I always start there. Just make sure you don't waste a whole lot of time and energy just to find out that you aren't even able to get the grant. So start there.
Yes, to piggyback on what Holly said, and one of the reasons why I deferred to her is when I first established the Arts Council of Wilmington and New Hanover County, she actually walked me through their grant making process. And so I appreciate that. I would agree wholeheartedly on knowing what the qualifications are. We have one of our grant programs where you cannot apply or you're not eligible if you are in a degree granting program. So we're a big college town, and if you are a sophomore in college or you're working on your thesis in graduate school, you don't qualify for the grant. So again, rather than waste anyone's time, it's good to know the parameters very early on. I think it's also necessary to make certain that you are aware of the submittal guidelines. And those are generally established in the general guidelines. And that is how we want the grant to be submitted. Many times I'll have a designated subject line so that we are sure to capture everyone who is applying for that particular grant. So if you have something totally different and have not followed the guidelines, you may be lost in this process. And so it's very important to know exactly what we're looking for in terms of the grant and also how to submit it.
Definitely. And I'm kind of chuckling to myself, get 3 grant administrators in a Zoom room and we'll talk about guidelines all afternoon. But I just want to put in there as well, the guidelines, everything that Rhonda and Holly mentioned, exactly, just to be efficient with your time, to make sure that you're even eligible to apply. But oftentimes the grant guidelines will also clearly state how the application will be reviewed. For lack of a better word, that's kind of like your sheet to make sure, hey, does my application meet all these review, criteria? So that might be, is there an artist involved, or, what community is this project going to impact? And so that review criteria is what panelists are using then to make their decisions to fund a project. So oftentimes it may seem a little mysterious of like, I submit this and where's it's going, but if you can really kind of hit those review criteria out of the park, that's usually a good sign when working on your application.
I'd like to jump in there too and say, as an artist, I know I have grant guideline and grant administrators here, so I'm in the minority of the group talking. But one of the things that would sometimes be missed by an artist is if the grant has subsequent years or previous years that you've applied for, and something in the guidelines is new or different. And you can overlook that really easily, especially if some of the grant guidelines refer to aspects of surviving or managing the pandemic. We still are seeing some of that. So as an artist, I would think about the big picture. Oh, this grant would allow me to do X, Y, and Z. But then I go to the guidelines and go, oh, well, they didn't have that last year. It's different.
I think, Lenora, that's why it's so very important to read the guidelines year after year, even with longstanding grants like the ones that we administer for the North Carolina Arts Council. Every year, invariably every year, there's something that's a tweak to the year before. And so I always encourage applicants to read the grant guidelines in their entirety before submitting each year.
Mm-hmm.
And Lenora, you brought up a good point from the artist perspective. I think, for those of us who are on the grants administrator side, we live we understand the full scope, but as an artist, sometimes you look at these guidelines and words and you forget that there are people behind it. And so do not be afraid to pick up the phone, to email and reach out to the staff who are coordinating the grant, because we want to help you. I mean, the most exciting thing about the grant making process is making the grants and writing those checks and getting that money to you. We want to do that. So, start by reading the guidelines first and going to the website. Start there, make your list of questions, but then email, pick up the phone, and, and this is on all levels. Even I have found with the National Endowment for the Arts, I mean, I remember my first application to them, I thought that, oh, nobody's going to be there to pick up the phone or help me through this. And I was so wrong. It was a great lesson for me because they were so willing to help. So reach out and actually talk to somebody.
Yes, that's a really valid point. That is exactly, for me, for instance, at the North Carolina Arts Council, I'm not a panelist. I'm not making the decision. My sole purpose, my whole job is to make the grant process more accessible and answer any questions you may have. And I'm always happy to provide feedback, just because I've, gotten to work and help artists through the grants process before. Can't overpromise anything, obviously, but that is, I always joke, I'm kind of like your guidance counselor. How can I help, maybe look at a budget, or, if you have some questions about work samples. Seriously, that is our role. We're here to assist. Great. Okay, so moving on to the application process. What should artists keep in mind when writing their grant application narrative? And on two questions. So what to keep in mind, and also what should artists avoid when drafting a narrative?
I'll take a shot at this. I'll say that it's very useful for applicants to look at past grantees for that particular grant, to get an idea of the size of grants that are awarded, the types of projects that are supported. I also think that it's very important that they be able to succinctly articulate what it is they're proposing to do, whether it's purchase equipment or avail themselves of a professional development opportunity. It's very, very important that you know what you're trying to say. And I'm not one for the very long narratives. I think if you can't say in one page what it is you need to accomplish, what you're trying to accomplish, and the means that you're going to use to accomplish that, then maybe this grant is not for you. I think gone are the days where people are writing 3 pages, of word salad, basically. I really like them succinct, and very tight.
Yes, I'll reiterate that, as concise as you can be and to the point, because a lot of times these panelists have so many applications that they're looking over that, if you're to the point, you have a better chance. I mean, and our panelists are always wonderful. I'm not saying that they won't read every application, but they will be able to give much more of their attention to the details if it is concisely written. And I would stay very much specific to the project. One thing I see, especially with our visual artists, when they apply, is sometimes they'll put their artist statement there, or, it'll be very flowery. And so that there's a place for that. This type of application, most project applications, if they want an artist statement, they will have that as an attachment separately. So the project narrative, really, you want to get to your goals. What are your goals for this project? I always let my artists know, 1 to 3 goals, don't go above that. And then also talk about how are you gonna know those goals, you've reached those and that you're successful. So, having your evaluation match the goals. And if you do that and get right to the point, you're going to have a much better chance.
Something that I see often, and also among visual artists, is they have excelled in one medium and want to transition into another. We need to have work samples that show this kind of leap in genre, if you will. We want to see that you are an established artist in this vein, that you want to start experimenting with this particular medium, and maybe, you know, some sense of where you're going with that. So maybe if we're asking for 5 work samples, provide 3 of the work that you have already mastered, and maybe 2 with the direction that you want to go in.
One thing that I'd like to jump to with the avoiding, what to avoid, is, you know, most of these applications have a place where you can upload or attach a resume or a CV. And so one mistake that I see a lot of different artists make is in that project narrative, they talk about all their accolades and awards and performances and what they're doing, you know, they're all different things, and take up that precious time and space. You have the ability to put that in your resume and CV. So stay very focused on explaining your project, and not, you know, that's great, you've gotten all these awards and other grants and performed at so many different stages, but there's a place for that, and it's not in the project narrative.
I have a couple of questions here, and I wanted to add a comment on, you know, the project narrative from an artist's perspective, that it is, an artist might not have the presence of mind to get right to the point initially. And it's been helpful in the past when I've been a grant panelist or working on my own grants to bullet point the things I want to do first on, you know, a scratch paper or my working document, and then start to write a couple of sentences for each of those bullet points, and then let someone look at that who is a colleague or friend whom I trust or who has grant experience. Because as an artist, we might start to talk pie in the sky or ethereal or in a very artistic way about rainbows and butterflies. And this is not to make fun of anyone, because I've been that person writing about rainbows and butterflies, and use the last 25 words to say, you know, I want to do a concert, I want to have a masterclass, I want to, you know, do audience discussion. And so having someone look at your project narrative first can be very helpful in making sure that it stays succinct and that it gets right to the point. Okay, we have 2 questions, both from the same artist, Lynette Busholti. She asks, it seems like some grants ask for artists to be established already. So are you saying that new artists shouldn't apply for grants? When in your career is it appropriate to start seeking grants? And then the second part of her question, or third part of her question, is what are actionable steps you can take to build your portfolio to be grant ready?
Holly, you want to start?
Yeah, well, I think that's where it goes back to the guidelines. You know, there are so many different types of grants out there, and different levels and different granting agencies. And so start with the guidelines. We are so lucky here in North Carolina to have the North Carolina Arts Council's Artist Support Grant. And I think that is a wonderful place to start if, you know, you're based in North Carolina, because a lot of emerging artists are eligible and able to apply for those and receive those. And a lot of times it's because of that project narrative, explaining how it's going to help you grow as an artist. So of course there's so many different levels, but the more you do it, which, you know, we'll talk about in a little bit, the more you do it, even though you might get rejection after rejection, it is great practice to put together a packet, put together that information. And then as far as building your resume, just getting out there as whatever your art form is, having as many experiences as you can to build that resume, and your, work samples, strengthen those. So it's just getting out there. You got to do that, and reading those guidelines and picking up the phone and talking to staff to say, hey, do you think that this is a good opportunity for me?
All right. Do we want to include Ms. Taj in the
Yeah,
discussion?
so say what we're gonna take. Saba, we're so excited you're here. I'm gonna read your bio, and Sabotage is an artist as well, so she'll be able to bring the artist perspective to these conversations. As I mentioned, has also been a guest panelist with us. So Saba, I'm gonna read your brief bio, and then we'll jump back into discussion. So Sabotage is a visual artist based in Durham. Inspired by Islamic story, sci-fi, and revolution, Taj's work explores representation, the gaze, queerness, and the body. Their work employs interdisciplinary practices, including mixed media drawing, painting, and collage, sewing, and performance. Through these techniques, Taj seeks to celebrate subjects who are often characterized as monstrous, highlighting their hybridity and luminality as an embodied resistance to subjugation. Taj was the 2019-2020 post-MFA Fellow for the Documentary Diversity Project at CDS, former Executive Director of the Garriot Modern Art, Southern Constellations Fellow at Elsewhere Museum, and featured speaker at TEDx Duke in 2017. Hi, Saba. We're so happy you're here.
Hey, thank you. I feel like I should just jump in on this question since we're here. Yeah. So as far as like, when do you start applying for grants? I think it's just a great idea to get started and, get that practice, and just like, Holly was saying, like, read those guidelines. There's different grants for different folks. And sometimes, they'll define something like emerging artist means different things for different grants. And one thing that I often do is look at past recipients and get a sense of, what have they been doing? And that'll also give you some insight into like, where have they been showing and what kind of opportunities were they going after? And, looking at local opportunities, one thing about that is like finding what's your niche, where are you going to be, like I look for local things, and then also who are folks who are doing work that is like my specific category where I can really stand out and I'm not part of some huge national broad pool, but where I can really find something that speaks to exactly what it is that I'm talking about or I'm working with. And it's also a good idea to kind of get a sense of what grants are out there, because that might, spark something in terms of the kind of work that you might do. Not that you want to cater your practice to those opportunities necessarily, but sometimes there can be some nice interaction in seeing like, where are those opportunities to get funding and how can that intersect with interests that you have. And that might be a way to, find, a new direction or a new path. Yeah. So I think I'll just stop there. Thank you all so much for having me.
The only other, I will just offer in reference to the initial question, which was at what point in your career should you begin? And I would agree that it should be, as early and as often as possible. I do know that through the artist support grant that we administer, we give probably about half and half. We have half of the applicants who are emerging and half are veterans of whatever their discipline is. In fact, that's really the only way that we know some artists are out there is through these grant applications and getting to know more about them. So no particular time.
I wanted to add that I look for newsletters from arts organizations, arts councils, trade conference organizations, where they list grants that are coming up and grant cycles for organizations and opportunities, as well as they might differentiate what are for emerging artists, new artists, even artists that are in college. So the Jazz Education Network is an international organization, and they have a number of applications and grant applications for college students because they want to increase the membership of college students. So there's an opportunity to learn and start applying early and often.
One last thing I'd like to add too is sometimes we think, from the artist perspective, we think it needs to say grant. We're looking for very specific, like I will apply for a grant. And there's so many other types of opportunities out there that aren't labeled grant, but you are still able to apply for and get compensation. And, so residencies, different kinds of contests in certain ways, depending on your art form. There's a lot of public art projects, opportunities out there, or other requests for proposals or requests for qualifications for presenting artists as well. And something I tell my students, I teach community arts management at East Carolina University, is that sometimes as an artist, you can approach a nonprofit arts organization with an idea for a project and work hand in hand with them to write a grant application for a specific project. And many of our community artists we hire for our outreach programs and our grant programs, to be able to compensate them at a professional rate. And but it has been them approaching us or us working in partnership to be able to do that. So sometimes it doesn't come in that exact form. And those opportunities could even result in longer partnerships, even careers. I've had some former students and interns who actually their job they have now came from the seed of a grant program.
Really great point. It reminded me, I put in the chat, the North Carolina Arts Council, we do have what's called our Artist Opportunities webpage, and we update it every week. So it's both with like grants, professional development, fellowship, calls for proposals, both here within the state or regionally, but also nationally. So we also have an accompanying e-newsletter as well, and we make sure to include information about our grant opportunities for artists there as well. So just put that in the chat and feel free to always sign up, but that's a really great point. There are other opportunities in addition to the grant, and still really helpful to gather this information if you were preparing for a grant to have on file and ready to kind of send out if you were to go for a fellowship or a residency. It's worth putting in that time to kind of get your toolkit, for lack of a better word, together. All right, moving on. Everyone's favorite part of a grant application, the budget, right? So for the application process, how specific should artists be with their proposed project budget in the application? And how can the budget serve as a tool to strengthen their proposal?
I find that panelists are really more keen on those applications that have as much of the information as possible. So the one thing you do not want to do is have the panel sit, review your application, look at your work samples, and still have questions. So you want to put in as much information as possible. And as it relates to the research that goes into it, if you are making an equipment purchase, or you're proposing to make an equipment purchase, and you've done a Google search and you've shown a range, that this piece of equipment is, going to range between $1,000 and $1,200, and have given examples of who was selling this. Amazon might have it for this price, a Best Buy might have it for this price. That just shows that you have done your homework. You know what this is going to cost, and it also helps you to fine tune what you really, really need for this project. So if you have applied for a camera and you find that, the grant is really only going to give $1,000, the camera is $1,000 by itself, then you're going to have to back off from the special lenses and those types of things. So I think that it helps to clarify what is doable with a particular grant.
I think, as Rhonda said, as detailed as you can be, the better. And having that supporting documentation, I have been, the staff moderator for many, many panels, and I've also been a panelist. And so I've seen it both ways, where somebody, the work samples are great, the narrative's great, and then they get to the budget and it's so sparse or incomplete or confusing that, one big question is this feasible? Is this grant feasible, or the project? And, it just takes a little more time to get those details. And don't let it scare you. A lot of people go, I've never put a budget together. I look at it like, you get to go on a shopping spree for this specific project. Make it fun. And if, our artist support grants that we disperse have a maximum of $1,000. So sit there and go, $1,000. What could I get to be able to achieve these project goals? And I've had some applicants who have just stellar applications, and the maximum grant is $1,000, and they will ask for $648.23. And the panel looks over it and goes, why didn't they ask for the 1,000? Like, just add it into the budget, because they would have gotten it. So definitely those 2 points I just want to make. If there is a maximum realistic range, go for it, but just have that supporting documentation there, because I have had, depending on the genre, you also have to think about, of course, we hope these panelists will be experts in their field, but you could be working with some kind of equipment, or sometimes it comes like with publishing or production, that you're utilizing equipment that some of these panelists might not truly understand. And I have seen that happen over and over. Like, why would it cost this much? Explain that. And with that supporting documentation, you can say, yes, I could get this camera for $200 somewhere, but I need this very specific piece of equipment to do this. So spell that out.
And speaking of spelling out, please avoid the use of acronyms. You may know what a PCD is, but I don't. And so you really need to spell out these acronyms. And just a final note on the feasibility of a project, you can have as much artistic merit as you'd like. If you are presenting us knowing that our grant is $1,000 with a proposal for something that is $20,000, then clearly you didn't read the guidelines, nor have you established how you're going to come up with the other $19,000.
But hop in there. One of the best advice I heard when I was applying for grants, and being on the other side, was let your budget tell a story. So it's like, when you can look at this itemized budget, you can really walk through, and for instance, if it's like an after-school youth program residency, you can really, okay, here's the artist stipend. This is what, definitely should be getting paid for a certain amount of workshops. And especially, for instance, if it's a workshop and it has 80 students and there's a low materials budget, there's going to be some questions, right? So you really want to make sure your budget, when they're going through it, when panelists are going through it, it tells its story and it's reflective of what you're illustrating in your narrative. Just make sure it connects back. It's like, yes, this is the project they're going to do. This does sound really feasible, and here's how it's going to happen. So I always just say, so numbers aren't, I know, everyone's favorite thing, but I just say, if you can let it tell that story and really emphasize and enhance your narrative, is a good way to also approach it.
I love that. I love that also, because as an artist writing writing grants and writing grants actually now in an administrative position, I look at it as my budget for when an artist asks me, like the questions that we have, and we have some new questions. How do you know what to put in a budget, or why is the budget so scary? Just think about, what does it cost you to live, your living costs, for instance. If I had to make an analogy, how much is your rent? How much are your utility bills? What do you need to put gas in your car? What do you need to add food in your refrigerator? It's the same thing. If you want to do a concert, or if you want to do a workshop or a residency or a presentation, what does it cost to make the product that you're going to present? What does it cost for your time, and how do you measure time? Some great questions coming up about that. And and what that will cost. And then how much money do you have to go toward those costs? Those are your basic income and expenses. The grant applications vary in that they may have different delineations and breakdowns for each of those areas, according to if it comes from you or if it comes from in kind, right? For whomever you're working with, or if you're doing it in a church basement, or if you're doing it with the Hayti, or if you're doing it with a collaborative partner. But to remove the scariness about the budget, it's really how much do you have and how much do you need? It's just kind of like the bare bones about it. We have some questions, panelists. One of the questions is, Holly mentioned, this is from Antonio Alanis. Holly mentioned the budget and salary. What is equitable payment to pay for one's time as an artist? How does one find this? And he has a second part of that question. When starting a grant, do you recommend starting with the narrative or the budget first? I'll do that question first, and then we'll go to the second question.
Holly, that was your question.
As far as the equitable payment,
What do you consider equitable for an artist?
Yeah. So really, I mean, each field has a different standard. So do that research, and again, reach out to the professionals. You know, that is overall, I have found our arts community is so generous with sharing that information. And don't just stop with one person, because everybody's going to have there's a range there. And I think there's a range, and you also have to look at where are you in your career. Sometimes I see people who, you know, have just been doing this a couple years, and they're charging similar rate to somebody who's been doing it for 20 plus years. So ask around, ask your professional artist friends and emerging artist friends. That is something that I know we have really put into practice here in Pitt County, as far as public art goes, mural projects go. We had to get those off the ground first. And so we got publicly shamed a little bit when we first started doing our mural community programs, because we were not offering equitable compensation to our artists. And so we got those community engagement projects off the ground, but we backed up and we did our research to say, wait a minute, what is equitable? You know, we can't be paying a mural paint, an artist, $1 a square foot. We need to be paying them $20 or $30 a square foot, and also offering materials. So do that research, reach out, but also reach out to the specific granting agency, because they also may have recommendations as well. Great question.
And I think that the market rates are also specific to each community. So I think that what we're paying musicians in Wilmington is not what we're paying musicians in Greenville. So you really have to be mindful of where you are, what the discipline is, how many people you have working in that field. And so it becomes more of a mathematical formula. What I do, we have a number of opportunities coming up, and I am asking the artists that we hope to engage what is an acceptable honorarium for the work that you do and the length of time that it takes to do it, just to kind of establish some baseline. Now, I will negotiate, but I always start out with the premise that these are artists, they need to be paid, and I want them paid equitably.
Okay, these are great questions and answers. And Antonio also wanted to know, do you recommend starting with the narrative or the budget first?
I think now that I've heard Kathleen, I'm going to start with the budget. But I hadn't heard of that. I'm always trying to wrap my head around the concept. But that's, maybe I'm just looking at it the wrong way.
Maybe you can't go wrong, really. I think if anything, just make sure that the narrative matches the budget matches the narrative. That might be kind of my best advice. But yeah, and I should say a lot of times panelists, they really do, not to harp on about the budget, but they really do, when they're trying to get some specific details and maybe can't find it in the narratives, they'll go to that budget. So don't think it's, I'm not trying to cause more additional stress, because again, I'm always happy to look at budget drafts for any of our grant categories, but do just make sure it really ties in with your narrative, and then thinking about that narrative tying back with the review criteria for the guidelines.
That I want to be, oh, go ahead, Sabotage.
Yeah, I was going to say that for the narrative and the budget, this is something I actually tell my drawing students, is to work from general to specific, but actually look at the whole picture. Because those two things are going to be in conversation. If you start with that, kind of core idea, which hopefully is, what you're showing up for, is that there's something like in your heart that you want to make happen. And, you're getting a, general sense of what that is, and then a general sense of what that looks like in the budget. And then from there, you're gradually going to get more specific on both ends, and as you see what's possible based on the budget, because we're always working within parameters, even when we're not applying for something, we're working within some constraints. And that shapes the kind of work that we do and that we make. So you'll be thinking about those things in conversation with one another, and telling that story of what, this project might be. So that would be my advice, is do both.
I love that, working from what you want to create in your heart. And there's one more question we have from the participants, but I want to throw a fly in the ointment about the narrative and the budget. At what point in distilling down to maybe the competitive part, where you have to eliminate some of the applicants and choose the last few, are the narrative and the budget a deciding factor?
I would say the narrative would probably factor in, because most of the time for our grants, we do have upper limits of the grant. And at least here in Wilmington, I know that we run out of money way before we run out of talent. And so it's the strength of the application, the narrative in particular, because the budget is going to be clocked at $1,000. So that's not so much in play as it is the narrative, the strength of the application.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Rhonda, because, it's really the project. And Saba, that was just beautiful. It has to come from the heart. It really does. And I think about that even when my organization applies for grants, because sometimes it can become sort of this competitive nature of, you see a grant opportunity out there, like, I have to apply for that. But if it really doesn't, if you're not passionate about it and it doesn't align with your mission and what you want to do as an artist, then you shouldn't apply for it just to get this money, unless it aligns. So start there. The narrative is so important. And I have seen panel after panel, if it is a successful project narrative and project idea, even if the budget, doesn't align all the way, but it's almost there, the panel will go, okay, you know, our max is 1,000. We're going to do, we understand this here, 500, we'll do 500, or we'll reach out and ask for specifics. So to me, like Rhonda, I think the narrative definitely is the main point. But again, send that budget to the staff because they will point out those inconsistencies and help you with it. Whereas they can give pointers about the narrative, but it's your project. So it's got to be a good project idea. That's really what it's got to start with.
And one thing that I've been really impressed with what is the level of sophistication for our panels. You know, I don't know whether I just have had great luck in that regard, or if people who are committed to this process really give it their all. So we'll have something where the work samples are top notch. The narrative is okay. They want to go back to a workshop that they've attended like 2 or 3 times in the past. And the panel will flag it and say, wait a minute, is this becoming kind of codependent here? What is going to help them advance their artistic career to the next level? This is kind of a lateral thing. So let's award this money to someone who's doing it for the first time or stretching themselves in some way.
They're all great questions.
Excellent. So this last question, I'm sorry, did Kathleen, were you going to make a comment?
No, yeah, go ahead. One more question. I'll move on.
Okay, so Lynette Busholti wanted to know, a point of intimidation is when grants require detailed budgets of day-to-day operations. How do you gauge these rates without an exact budget to base them off of?
Say if that's day-to-day operations as far as working with an organization or a similar, you know, if it is within that type of arts career, again, you really just have to find that professional and ask them about it. If it's still not clear, I'll probably say this 50 times today, you know, talk to the granting agency staff and they can really help you figure that out.
Clarify, yes.
So I just want clarification on what the question is, because as I understand it, for individual grants, if you were an individual artist applying for a grant, it's doubtful that we're asking for your day-to-day, how you paying your rent, you know, where's your car payment coming from? We're not asking those kinds of questions. If you're talking about an organization should have a budget, an annual budget in place, and show where this project fits within the scheme of their whole budget. So maybe we get some clarification from the person who asked this. Says this grant was for artists, but it was very broad. Okay. That's not been my experience with individual artists. We're not asking for really detailed information about their personal finances or their day-to-day. We're asking about particulars related to the grant.
Okay. Thank you very much for answering that. She said they had a starting range and potential ending.
Yeah, I would contact the granting agency staff and get clarification for that. And then if they put it back in your realm, then reach out to other professional artists in your field.
Yeah, it says the grant allows for the artist to decide. I'm sorry, I need to back that up for a sec. There was something in the chat. Lenora.
She's responding there. The grant allows for the artist to decide how they want to present as performances, educational, or as a group. And I think that Holly hit the nail on the head too, both Holly and Rhonda, is that if you have those kinds of questions and you're a little foggy about the range or how to create your budget and with respect to what they're asking or saying that they would present, I will go back and ask questions. Going to ask questions, sometimes artists don't call. I know I've been this artist. I won't call to ask questions because maybe then they'll remember me and flag me as someone who doesn't know what they're doing. Really, that was like, I would have that trepidation. And that's a real feeling.
It is.
And but I've never had a granting organization treat me as if my questions meant that I was incapable or incompetent in any way. And like Kathleen said at the beginning, there's someone designated to answer all manner of questions, because the granting organization needs to give the money away. So they need your questions and they need you to apply. When I've been a panelist and I've seen a budget that didn't compare to the great work samples and the great narrative and the great project idea, and then I see the budget and I go, oh no, this person they were afraid maybe to let on that they didn't know about budgets. And that's when you lean on the organization to help you as much as possible. She said, that's how I feel, Dr. Hammonds. Yeah, I've been there. I'm not ashamed to say my very first grant, I was working at a cultural arts center, and my boss at the time tricked me. And he said, oh, just fill out this form or these questions. And it was just about to Girls Incorporated. And I knew how many widgets I needed, how many ropes I needed for the girls to play double dutch, how many basketballs I needed for the basketball team, much the uniforms cost. And I just answered those questions. And later his assistant put it in a budget. And when he showed me, says, this is your budget, I was mind blown. I was like, that's a budget, right? It's just knowing how much things cost and how much you do or don't have. Right. So it doesn't have to feel intimidating if you allow yourself that opportunity to learn and grow, or just make it as simple. So I hear you, Ms. Bisholte.
And maybe you can just kind of psych yourself out, pretend that this is your budget and your money. How would you spend it? Which would be a variation on the narrative heavy and the budget first approach that Kathleen advocated for.
That's great.
And Kathleen made a great statement earlier when she said, please remember that the granting agency's staff are not the panelists. We do not, even if you call and ask a question, you think we would go, oh my gosh, we do not have the right to, well, we shouldn't think that way, and we don't. We love our jobs. This is our job to answer your questions, but we would never relay that to the panel. If anything, our job is to get you prepared as much as possible, so when it gets in front of the panelists, they're not going, why is this incomplete? But you have to give us the opportunity to help you. If you don't reach out, we won't have that ability to do that. So Definitely. No question is stupid. We want to help.
Exactly. No question is stupid. And before we move on to the next question, in fact, at the North Carolina Arts Council this year, for all of our grant applications, you have to talk to us. We actually want you to check in and just introduce yourself. And exactly, this is what I do. I love my job. I get to talk with artists all day about cool projects they're doing in the state. So that is actually something we're doing, because we've kind of touched on this before. We've changed our grants so many times. And so we're wanting to be transparent about what we have available and the process. So yes, please. I'm always happy to talk. So the next question, I imagine we'll get a lot of questions from participants. It still has to do with the application process, and specifically looking at the lens for teaching artists and how to ensure that their work is both dynamic. So it is dynamic, right? Because it is learner-centered while grounded in their practice. How can teaching artists ensure, I really do think they're rock stars in the art field. How can we ensure their work, transfers into the application when there is this duality to the practice?
I'm not really sure I understand the question.
I'll tell you what I see, and that doesn't work. So this is why I wanted to put this in this webinar. So sometimes it'll go to panel and teaching artists will provide, I call them action shots. So it's like a classroom, but it doesn't show them. It doesn't show their work. And oftentimes in the guidelines, panelists want to know the artist's work. And so it's like this fine line of, yes, that's what makes you so incredible, is you can engage with audiences, but we have to still make sure we can see your work as an artist. And so I think there's certainly a place, there typically is a place. We do want to see like the the practice and being in the classroom or at a community center or working, teaching artists in a healthcare setting. There's sometimes when we want to be able to see that engagement captured, but we also want to know who you are as an artist and your experience with your medium.
I think it goes back to writing a compelling narrative, because things like they're not easily translatable. You know, a teachable moment, a Photoshop with a classroom doesn't really articulate what it is you're trying to convey. So I think that it's really imperative that you have that nice, succinct narrative that you have honed, and you're using the same thing for all of these grants. You're just changing the language to match the grant, but you should already have a clear vision of what it is you're hoping to do. There's a saying, we teach best that which we're most in need of learning. And so I think that if you go at your narrative with that type of focus, saying, this is what I'm trying to impart to people, that helps provide the framework by which you talk about your contributions to the field, whatever field that is, if I'm understanding the question correctly. Because I think that still the narrative is going to be the only opportunity that panelists get to see for where you are in your career and where you hope to go.
Definitely. Yeah, teaching artists work is so learner-centered, right? It's not, and so sometimes, exactly, Rhonda, I think making sure that you make it very clear who your audience is and how do you engage with them is so important. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think I heard you kind of getting at this, and as a panelist, something that I would be interested in seeing is like, what is that through line from the artist's work to the student's work to their method, and that there's something that actually ties all of that together. And I think there can be a lot of poetry in those different, aspects, and seeing that, what an artist cares about, how that's transmitted to students and how that shows up in a product is what I would want to see. And I think the work samples are also a place where that can happen. So yeah, not excluding your personal work, even if that's not the necessary outcome of whatever program. There should be some kind of common thread, because I want to know why you are the one to be teaching this or doing this. And usually there's some kind of connection there.
Saba, I think that's such an important part of, I think as teaching artists, it is also important to remember to cultivate your own artistry. And, it is hard when your expectations of the teaching part grow so large that sometimes you don't continue to cultivate and get that out, your own work out there. I mean, I know we have a couple educators on this webinar, and it's really demanding, but to remember, and I love what you said about that thread, remember that the reason why you love to teach your art form is the art form itself and that process, and to let that come through. And we have so many incredible teaching artists out there, and even if you may not think your process and the outcome of your art form relates to your teaching, it so does. So find that and remember that passion of why you create. I always go over and over, what is that core reason why we all create, why we do what we do, and remember that. And a lot of times that directly flows, as Saba said, from your own work and process to your teaching. So thank you for that, Saba.
It really became clear what Saba has just said and what you just spoke about, Holly, when we had an alum of our Teaching Artist Certificate program who didn't have a tactile art form. She was a concept artist. She felt like her art was in bringing communities together around an event or topic. And it really stretched our idea of how to train her in the program so that her work could live and be embodied in residencies. And to that end, she's created a training program for community leadership. So sometimes your art is in networking conversations with groups of disparate people. Or sometimes some people, you can see how they manage a room, and it is an art, a fine art to almost have these kinds of conversations, but to bring a mastermind of energies from an event, whether they are talking about Harriet Tubman or talking about game design. But if you bring enough people together who are interested in a particular topic, there is an art in that. And it was fascinating how she would come to articulate once we said, well, how are you engaging people? She was very clear about how she was engaging people. And then said, okay, well, in what setting does it happen? And what are the vehicles that you use to have the conversation move from person to person if people are not having a meeting of the minds? And she was very clear. And that's the same raw stuff that teaching artists use. So it was out of the box thinking, but it really distilled the nuts and bolts of what it means to be a teaching artist.
And lastly, I actually usually get a lot of questions about work samples in my day-to-day. So I wouldn't be surprised if they come back towards the end here. These are maybe more the drier, less exciting pieces of it. But if an application asks for 5 work samples, just provide 5 work samples. Don't provide more. Don't provide less. Goes back to those guidelines. And I mentioned that just because thinking about being in the panelists' shoes, they may be reviewing hundreds of applications. When that happens, we usually get a significant number for any of our artist fellowship grants. And so, the panelists do give it the time, but you have to remember they're seeing a lot. So be very smart and savvy in like the pieces you're selecting. There's like a cohesiveness to them. It relates back to the narrative. It relates back to the project, but also it's not like you're going to get a gold star for giving double amount of work samples. In fact, it's just keep it clear and concise and let it really tell your story.
I would agree. And to that, I would just add one thing, and that is, I know one of the issues that we deal with in our grant pool, particularly for the artist support grants, is the quality of the visual images. If they might have, just world-class art in person, but they've not been able to photograph. They don't have the ideal conditions by which to show it, to best effect, if you will. And so that's one thing that we run into constantly, where the photo image does not really do the justice to the actual piece.
Yeah.
So I would be mindful of that.
And same with production, performance is, the documentation is key. And even going back to the sort of learner-centered applications, same thing. Think about, sometimes we forget that documentation, I always say if you don't have your work documented, you can't say, well, this performance was amazing, I wish you were there. Well, people can be there, maybe not live, but especially the last 2 years, we know we can still get the idea across digitally, but make sure the sound is good, the visuals are good, and they can see actually what's happening.
Great. Okay, so the application process is done, it's submitted, now what? So the next question is all about demystifying the panel process. So like, what exactly goes on once the application is submitted? And so I was wondering if you all, both as your roles as like shepherding applications through a process, as well as being a panelist before, could you just share kind of what happens next?
So once the application deadline has arrived and we have cataloged all of the applications that we've received, and again, I'm going to go with the artist support grant because individual artists, and we get so many more of them than we do organizational support grants. And so within 2 weeks of the deadline, myself and our arts partners in neighboring counties for the artist support grant generally come up with a list of possible panelists. We are looking for geographic parity, especially in the case of the artist support grant, where you have 5 counties in our region. We'd like some representation from, some of the rural parts of the region, as well as Wilmington, which is the hub, of course, of southeastern North Carolina. And we also take a look at where the bulk of the applications came in, what type of artists the bulk of applications came in from. Invariably, it's going to be visual artists. We have so many more visual artists than we have musical artists that are applying for grants anyway, or theater people. And so we break down by discipline, how many applications we have in each, and ensure that we got visual artists, and we ensure that we have at least 1 or 2 panelists who are in the visual arts field, and that could help us determine the quality of works. Because what I found with visual arts in particular, people just know what they like. They're not necessarily trained in what is good visual arts. And so we provide all of the applications, all of the work samples, guidelines for the panel itself, including conflict of interest statements, 2 weeks before the panel sits. We hope that by that time they've had time to review all of the applications. And so they're not just coming and seeing the applications for the first time on panel day. They have already started triaging, if you will, what they're going to be asked to make a final decision on the panel day. So they have some sense of, comments, initial impressions that they had of the application, whether it's artistic merit, the feasibility of a project, or any of the other criteria that have already been pre-established. We don't make it up as we go along. We like to have the rules in place at the very beginning. And so we comprise 5. We're going with smaller panels these days. We're fortunate to have Zoom. It's a way to record it, be able to share information and all of that. There will come a time when we'll probably meet in person, but for right now, this has worked well, I think, for most organizations to be able to disseminate this information electronically. We meet, we go through every single application. The only time that we make any prejudgments is if at the end of the scoring, we have applications that fall below a certain threshold. And again, that is dependent upon which grant it is. For the most part, if we're going from what score of 1 to 5 on feasibility and artistic merit, and you're getting a 2, then that becomes the cutoff point for what will or will not be considered. And then we go down. Generally, the panelists, once the scores are ranked, they will want to fully fund those organizations that are at the top. As we start running out of money, as you get a little further down, we might make partial grants, depending upon whether or not your project can be still be satisfied in any significant way through a lower amount. And then we take the information back, the recommendations from the panel, to the Arts Council's Board of Directors, who vote on that, and then we make announcements to the general public, to the grantees and the general public.
And to reiterate what Rhonda was saying, these panelists spend a lot of time. They really do, and are so generous with both their time and also their expertise. And many of our panelists for our individual granting programs are themselves working artists. And so they truly understand, they've been in your shoes. And that's something really important to us when we put our panel together. And we do a similar thing as Rhonda does for our individual artist grants, is that we wait. We don't ask our panelists before we get our applications in. We wait because we want to see the different genres, and we specify our panelists for the different areas, and so we get those experts on hand to be able to be there, but they spend a lot of time. They have a lot of time, even though some of them might not feel like they have enough time. We try to give them as much time, at least 2 weeks, as Rhonda said, to read through everything. And we give them a rubric. We give them a scoring sheet that is very specific. And that's a way the initial scores can come through. So before even coming together with the other panelists, they have already averaged the scores for just that one panelist for the artist they've reviewed. And depending on the type of grant program, sometimes we just see if the multiple panelists, those scores align. And what is really interesting, a lot of times they do align very closely. And if they do align, we move forward. If it's a larger pool of applicants and more panelists, everybody will bring their, everybody will send me their average score. And as Rhonda said, if there's some artists that fall with the average of all those panelists scoring put together fall below the threshold, they may not make it to the next level. A panelist can bring them up for discussion in that final panel meeting if they really want to advocate for that applicant. But a lot of times, say we get 100 grant applications in, all those panelists will look over every 100, every one of those 100. Nobody's left out. Everybody's application gets reviewed. However, instead of 100 applications coming forward for discussion at the panelist meeting, perhaps only 20%, the top 20 will be discussed. But like I said, anybody can bring it up. So a lot of time goes into it. But these panelists love what they're doing, and they want, again, just like our staff who's like, I can't wait to mail out these checks. They get excited, they get engaged. I've had panelists reach out to me afterwards and say, can you please give this specific artist my contact information? I would love to help them out. So just remember that it's a process that is, it is clearly thought through.
Yeah. And Kathleen, one other thing is we sometimes have a separate judge or two based on whether or not the work sample is in a discipline that is really not very well known. Like, I remember one person who submitted an application and she wanted to do something with pinhole photography. Well, I don't know good pinhole photography from bad pinhole photography. So we ask people, and that's an isolated incident. That sometimes we have musical genres that are really kind of obscure or not well known. So we do ask for another level of professional assessment based on whether or not this is in our wheelhouse of understanding.
Great. And I saw Antonio's question. We're going to keep on circling back to those guidelines every time we can, but asking like what's in the rubric, mentioning maybe artistic merit and feasibility, guidelines. That is your answer. That is your roadmap to how those panelists are going to be reviewing your application. There usually is a section that says review criteria, and that is what's on their rubric. So you're seeing exactly what the panelists are going to be expected to review on. And I can't emphasize enough, I'm pretty old school. I usually print out my guidelines, even the ones I'm helping with, and highlight. I tell everyone spend at least 10 minutes to really take a deep dive in there. because you can find out what the panelists will be using to rate your application.
Yeah, we do include that information in the guidelines.
I love that because I use the guidelines to write my final report. Even after I've gone through the grant and I've delivered everything, I think I just go back and make sure, what did I say I was going to do? What did the guidelines say? Why did I get this money? And you know, just dotting all the I's and crossing the T's. And sometimes sometimes I've volunteered to be a panelist when I wanted to learn more about an organization or a granting process for an organization like the NEA or like a very big grant. So I'm going to shut up because I know we have another question to get to before our Q&A.
Sabotage, you want to jump in?
Yeah, so just real quick, from like being on the panel, I just, it is like a really, like there's such rich conversations that happen. And every time I've been on a jury panel, like there are so many deserving folks. So when you don't get it, you know, it can feel so crushing. It happens to me all the time. But like a lot of people will get to see your work, will talk about it in depth, and also will remember you. So there's kind of a networking that happens just through applying. People will know your name and things can come of that, even if you don't get the grant. And I think like one thing that I've really loved about being on these panels is those conversations and being influenced by other folks who have different expertise and vice versa. You know, someone who's like, I see this thing about this application, something that maybe I didn't notice. And we can really influence each other in that way. So those are just some other little pieces to bring in about the panel process behind the scenes.
And the other thing too, to piggyback on that, there are some grants you can apply for that the panelists have recommended you from seeing you from another grant cycle, from another grant process, like the MacArthur Genius Grant or United Fellowships Grant. There are many artists for the musician side, but you can apply for. And so it's important to remember that that process doesn't have to feel like all or nothing.
Right.
Yeah, I remember one time that a specific artist did not receive the grant, but in that panel discussion, one of the panelists was like, wow, this person would be amazing for this public art project. And that person, you know, instead of getting the $1,000 grant, they got a $35,000 commission, you know? So, hey, so just remember that. I mean, we're as panelists, because I have been on the panel side a lot and just watching the panelists as the staff moderator, you know, the wheels are constantly turning and it's just really exciting to see the talent that's coming through and going, wow, you know, this musician, you know, I have an opportunity for them. And, you know, so it's an exciting group of people who, and a lot of times they are volunteering to be there. This past year was the first year we were able to provide stipends, thankfully to the North Carolina Arts Council for giving us the ability to do that. But most of the time, and they're small stipends, I'll tell you, it is truly a service and a volunteer. So they're there because they want to be there, not because it is their job and not because they're getting necessarily paid for it.
Great. So our next question is, let's say you got the grant. Now what? So is there anything that artists should be aware of once they've received a grant? Is there any additional maybe paperwork or things to keep in mind during the grant project period?
I know for the North Carolina Arts Council grants, we require that they send letters to our local delegation to the General Assembly. That's a requirement of all the grants that come through the North Carolina Arts Council. We're also becoming sticklers about getting the credit that we deserve. You know, they'll have, you know, have an event, and not so much, of course, because of COVID recently, but those things where you have an event, a program, and you're not naming how this project was made possible. We are going to really be monitoring that very closely. And then making certain that you send the final report in by the due date, because not once we receive the final report, we also have to make our own final report to the state, including numbers, attendance figures, all manner of information that we have to make available. And so I don't want to have to chase you down once you receive the money, done your project, and then we can't get the information that we need out of you to report back on how we spent the money.
And I would just also add, just like those guidelines, that's typically what I do when I apply for a grant. I read the guidelines, I think about what kind of project I want to do, but then I'll also check on the reporting specifications, because there are some grant opportunities out there that may not be worth your time if you didn't all the reporting that has to go into it. Our specific grants that we sub-grant and grant, we try to make our reporting as simple as possible. However, if it's something like you need to document, if you have an exhibition or a performance that you need that documented, maybe that's a requirement. Well, you have that performance, you forgot to document it. You can't, unless you do it again, or if it's saving receipts or, different things. If you know it beforehand, you can account for it. And also, as far as deadlines go, know the project time frame, because you don't want to get to December 20th and realize, oh my gosh, I have to spend this money and do my project by December 31st. Give yourself time. And, if you do the pre-work ahead and know what the expectations of reporting are, you're good. Also, thank the granting agency. And as Rhonda said, if it's a North Carolina Arts Council sub-grant or grant, thank the staff that helped you, and also thank any sponsors. But that also really, sometimes that's not an expectation, but it's a really amazing thing as somebody who puts a lot of time into this to get that thank you. It's like, oh, it somebody noticed too.
Yeah, these are all great. And I would just add in too, let's say you get a project grant and changes happen, right? Sometimes life happens. And we know with COVID, for instance, maybe you've done a project had to go virtual. Just be really upfront and clear with the grants funder. Again, I think we put it earlier, we actually want to get this money out, right? That is our job, but we do have to make sure we're transparent and staying in line with the mission of the grant. So there may be a situation that if it was an artist project and there was a group of artists and an artist all of a sudden had to move out of state for a family reason, we try our best to try to work with you to make sure you can fulfill the mission of that proposal. But it's easier the sooner you can let us know. That way, for any reason, let's say it wasn't going to work out, and we may even have to, we don't want to get to a point that you have to return the grant funds, but it's so much easier to connect with us early on so we could try to troubleshoot and figure out a way that this could make all parties happy and work out in alignment with the grant. So just stay in communication, and usually you'll expect that. Oftentimes, for instance, we have the North Carolina Arts Council do some monitoring. So it just means I might come do a site visit to see how the program's going, or give a phone call or a Zoom call. So just want to check in, make sure everything's going as expected. And it's okay if it doesn't. We'd rather be transparent and we can kind of figure it out together. So on that note, because I know we're running out of time, what happens if you don't get the grant? Any good advice to share with artists?
If at first you don't succeed, try again. As I mentioned, we get 50 to 75 grants each year from individual artists, we're able to fund maybe a third of them. And so, as I mentioned earlier, we run out of money way before we run out of talent. We have a case this year where someone who was awarded money is not going to be able to use the grant. And so we're going to go down the line. The next person in line will, we'll make that available to that person if it's still feasible for them to complete their project in the time left. So, you know, again, we ask you to just resubmit again, making certain that your work samples and your narrative are strong, and that those aren't the holdups.
Yeah,
But just keep trying.
Keep trying. I will reiterate that, and I always use an example of when I was a very active visual artist. I received, for the same series of work, I received Best in Show for this specific jury show and got all 3 of my entries in that show. A year later, you know, not the exact pieces, but you know, it was similar types of work. It's a different juror, different panelist. I got nothing in. And don't get your feelings hurt. Use it as a learning process, but also know typically for our panels, we have them rotating every single year. So the same people are not looking at your work. And one of those first initial questions of when should you start applying for grants, and I said look at it as a learning process, getting your all your things together, your information together, knowing how to get your work samples professionally done, and also reach out. Some granting agencies will give you comments from the panel. We do that here in Pitt County. I know I was shocked. My first application to the National Endowment for the Arts, Our Town grant, we got a rejection, and I just took a chance and said, can I find out, you know, some of how to do this better next time? They actually had the panel's comments that the staff was able to share with me, and it was such a learning process. So reach out. Not all granting agencies do that, but try again. I've had many artists who have applied to our individual artist programs, you know, 2, 3, 4 times, and then that 4th or 5th time they get it. And so just keep trying and honing your application.
Right. And I would also say that you know, it's always relative to the pool of applicants in any given cycle. So, you know, this year you might have more of a focus or panelists who really appreciate visual arts more, though you're hoping that they are not biased in any sense. But it's also who else is applying that year? Do you have, you know, the best artists in your town applying, or do you have a mix of artists, established artists with, you know, lots of young talent that we hadn't seen before? So again, it's relative to the size of the pool.
Definitely. And I we also at the North Carolina Arts Council take minutes at all our panel meetings and are happy to provide feedback. I think when I was on the applicant end, I would have been maybe too scared to ask, but I'm hoping a big takeaway from this webinar is like to get in contact with whoever the grants administrator may be. And again, not everybody may provide it, but that's something I'm excited that we do provide that constructive feedback for artists.
I always ask for panelist comments, always.
Yeah, I think that feedback can be really clarifying for so many reasons. There's a grant that I didn't get, and after hearing the feedback, I was like, oh, I disagree with y'all about how you assessed the work. And what I'm getting at with that is that there is this way that it can feel really personal when you get a rejection, and there's a persistence in like putting yourself out there, and there's a different persistence that is your relationship to the work that you do. You know, you've really got to believe in it. And if you're making stuff that is contingent on external validation, you're going to be floundering, you know? So really you've got to have, you know, some solid sense of what you do and why you do it, so that you can go to those like great depths that will be recognized at some point. Because yes, behind the scenes, there's so much talent. People are appreciating your work, but you're going to get mostly no's. And that's the truth. And so you've got to be able to come back to your studio or whatever your practice is and feel so excited by what you're doing regardless. And then eventually, you know, it'll come.
The only other thing I will say about the rejection letters is that we definitely try to, and we do it, we accomplish it through email. I like to at least send an email before I send the letter, so that any press that we have with it, that's not your first time knowing that you didn't get the grant. It's through the newspaper, you know. I think that that's really important, to make contact with those who you are not able to fund before they find out through another source.
Great, thank you. Thank you, everybody. These were great questions. I know we're at time. I'm gonna hand it over to Lenora just to share a little bit of information about our next webinar, but thank you, Holly, Rhonda, Sabotage. This has been really informative, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, panelists. I concur and I echo my colleague, Kathleen. Holly and Saba and Rhonda, you have been just extraordinary. The folks that have been putting things in the chat and thanking us and saying it was better than they expected. And so that's because of you. We really appreciate you. What we wanted to share was that on April 12th, you can register with the same link you registered for today for this amazing conference. I think that the teaching artist field has been blown open wide because National Endowment of the Arts and other organizations are supporting this national teaching artist conference that's happening April 5th, 6th, and 7th. TAG, Teaching Artists Guild, joined with Association of Teaching Artists from New York to make one national organization. They are now looked at. National Endowment of the Arts is really focusing on professional development for teaching artists. We couldn't be more thrilled. And we are planning on April 12th to hold a debrief of this event that's happening. So I want you to go, I put the link in the chat to this conference and register to attend the conference. But on April 12th, we are going to have a debrief of this whole conference, but it's some extraordinary events happening over 3 days. And TAG, if you're not familiar with this teachingartist.com website, they have an asset map where you can put yourself on the map so regionally, nationally, people can know where you exist. So this is a really extraordinary happening in our field, and we're very excited about it. So we want you to know about it. So make sure that on April 12th, if you do miss the conference, and the conference is free, if you do miss the conference, you can come on our webinar, the NCCU and North Carolina Arts Council webinar on April 12th, same time at 4 o'clock, and we will debrief you about this conference. So just wanted to say thank you again. I want to say thank you to my collaborative partner at North Carolina Arts Council. We're so grateful. Eileen and Anthony have helped this event today go smoothly. You can watch the video afterwards on our YouTube channel. And I think we've put so many things in the chat that you couldn't possibly not know what the next kinds of steps you can take.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.